Well, the 11th hour collapse of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement talks last month was yet another example of how tricky it is to get real multilateral trade reform with all those vested interests. In contrast, Australia has clocked up bilateral deals with Japan, South Korea and now China. Well, the former head of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, was at a European-American Chamber of Commerce lunch in Sydney today to offer his thoughts. Pascal Lamy, welcome to the programme.
My pleasure.
Well, our TPP, we've had this last-minute failure. What are the prospects, do you think, of it succeeding, and will it be worth it in trade terms?
Well, I think it will succeed, not least because the US president needs some sort of trade feather on his hat for his two mandates, and there hasn't been much of that so far.
Will he have to give up a lot? Because there was this very firm position he has on these US drug patents.
I don't think they will pay a lot. They'll pay with a bit of currency. So in a nutshell, I think it will happen, but with relatively modest results as compared to the drumming and the big noise. You know, that's the first 21st century agreement. So I think it will be modest.
Okay, so the clauses, the other concern, of course, is these clauses to allow foreign investors to challenge decisions by local courts, national courts, in international tribunals. Now, at the moment in Singapore, we've got this case with Philip Morris Asia challenging the Australian plain packaging laws on cigarettes. Should this be a concern for Australia?
Well, I think that there are grounds for concern, but you know the choice is relatively simple. If you're an investor in a country, either you trust the legal system of this country, or you don't. Would you trust Burma's or the Thai, or even the Indonesian legal system if you're an investor there? Not sure about that. Then the other option is a sort of specific litigation channel, which is what investor to state is about. And I think there are means to protect the sovereignty of nations from being hampered by adjudications in such a specific channel, provided this is agreed between the parties.
Do you think this will be part of a TPP?
I think it will be part of the TPP because it's a US constant request, and the investment part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a rather substantial one.
More broadly, do you think these, shall we say, plurilateral agreements, the TPP and indeed the European-American, the TTIP, are they useful additions to the trade process, or do they take away from world trade agreements?
Well, that's a very old debate, you know, whether multilateral agreements, whether bilateral or plurilateral, are sort of stepping stones or stumbling blocks. And trade academics have been dwelling on that for many, many years. My own experience is that it depends, and that's quite technically complex, but overall, they are more of stepping stones than stumbling blocks. In other words, whatever the color of the cat, what matters is that it catches mice, which is, at the end of the day, that obstacles to trade are reduced. Whether you do this unilaterally, bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally, at the end of the day, doesn't matter as much as whether or not you get the result you want.
Australia is just completing its free trade agreement with China. Now that's very much supported by our government. The unions here in Australia are extremely concerned that this is going to lead to Australian jobs being lost at the expense of jobs being imported.
I think it's a valid concern. You know, like most of these trade agreements, they work because they are painful. Opening trade is efficiency creating, it's growth creating, it's potentially welfare creating, but at a cost.
But this could involve actually jobs coming in from outside to be taken up.
Like in other areas, there will be a balance. some jobs will be lost, some jobs will be gained. The usual story of a free trade agreement between a country like Australia, which is more developed than a country of China, is that the jobs you lose are, let's say, poorly paid jobs. The jobs you win are highly paid jobs. So that's the normal story. But
so would you
it has to
support
be
that?
checked. Well, I mean, I don't know enough of the details, but you know, like always, I think the solution to that question lies in domestic capacity to offset, for those who lose their jobs, the handicap that represents in terms of training, in terms of funding properly, retraining people.
You have been in the region here at a time when China has decided to devalue the yuan twice now. To what extent does this impact the trade game, both in terms of either currency wars or indeed export wars?
Well, first, depreciation and devaluation are two different things. If your currency depreciates by 1 or 2%, this is not a devaluation. The reality with China is, again, rather simple. We all want China to internationalize its currency. We all want the renminbi to be more freely tradable on currency markets. We all believe that would be good for China and that would be good for us. Now, the road to getting an opening of the capital account of China, which is the road to a proper internationalization of the Chinese currency, which again is a good thing, will be bumpy. If you open your trade in your currency, you don't really know what's going to happen. And what happened this time is that outgoing capital flows were a bit larger than ingoing capital flows, which led to this 2% depreciation. But the important thing is whether or not we all, China and others, want to internationalize the yuan or the renminbi, which is the same word for the same currency. That's what really matters. If we all want that, let's organize properly the road to this important result.
Are you confident that the Chinese leadership does want this?
I do. I think this is part of their strategic macroeconomic agenda. It would be good for China because there is today a disproportion between the size of the Chinese economy, notably in international trade, and the size of its currency. The currency market for the renminbi of the yuan is very tiny. You don't really can buy or sell assets in renminbi or yuan denominated assets. So that's a problem for them. And I think long term, it's a good thing for everybody that they internationalize their currency. And I think they want to do that. And notably the Chinese central bank governor, Mr. Zhu, who's probably one of the best brains on this planet on this sort of issue.
Moving to global tax, how important is it for the G20 nations to actually solve this problem of transfer pricing around the world? And do you think it is possible to find a solution?
I think it's really necessary and it's possible. The problem is very simple. With globalization and sort of multi-localization of production processes, whether goods or services, the opportunities for what diplomats call excessive tax optimization, which we all know means you locate your profits where taxes are low and you locate your losses where taxes are high. The world system now allows for much more opportunities of this kind than in the past. So states have to react if they don't want to lose their fiscal mass. And that's what happened with the G20. And I think that's an area where the G20 has already provided some outcome, some results, and more to come. And I think it's, again, they cannot accept this sort of, race to the bottom through multinational.
But you think that the clampdown will come harder and it will actually change the way companies
operate? I think it will
operate?
happen at the end of the day because otherwise they lose too much of their fiscal mass. Or either they have to reduce expenditure, which is not nice to do, or they have to tax people and not corporates, which politically speaking is probably more difficult to do. So I think it will happen. It has started, and it's, in my view, a reasonably positive development.
Finally, we've got the upcoming conference on climate change in Paris. What should we be looking for in terms of an outcome, an achievement there?
I think what really matters, is whether countries are serious about reducing carbon emissions. Now, whether you do this with a sort of hard law, whether you do this with soft law, what matters is that at the end of the day, the outcome of this is a serious process of monitoring carbon emissions, which we need to do. And in the case of Australia, it will probably, and I'm not saying this as French, but as an expert, it will probably need a bit more efforts than what has been done so far. Australia, for some years, let's say for the last 2 or 3 years, has been lagging behind in an area where it should be leading together with Europe, US, other countries.
What are the consequences, though, if we decide that we're going to be a follower and not a leader in this space?
I think if Australia is just environment taker, the specific interests of Australia in areas like mining or agriculture will probably be less factored in the end result than they would be if Australia was a leader. That's the case in all negotiations.
And do you think it could affect our trade negotiations in other areas, such as agriculture?
I think it will reshuffle the comparative situation of agriculture, mining, transport, if we are really serious about reducing carbon emissions. And, Australia will be affected like others. And then the question is whether you're in the driving seat or not.
Pascal Lamy, thank you very much for joining me.